FMC Fast Chat takes you inside the news so you can be in the know in 30 minutes. Hosted by Fair Media Council CEO and Executive Director Jackie Clement, Fast Chat features notables in news, media, and business. Shows are recorded live and driven by questions from the audience for conversations that are real, powerful, and relevant. This week's episode features Ben Smith, media columnist for the New York Times.
Today, we're happy to be chatting with Ben Smith, media columnist for the New York Times. Hi, Ben.
Hey, thanks for having me.
One of the things we always talk about at Fair Media Council is the importance of building a relationship with a reporter so they actually pay attention to your pitch. How important is it to you to actually have an established relationship with someone who's pitching you?
You know, it kind of depends. I mean, I think it really particularly in this gig, I'm only writing one column a week. And so you sort of it's not mostly kind of coming from PR pitches. I think it's actually less relationship and more like having a sense of what you do for a living and what kind of stuff you write. So I think the most annoying pitches, and people don't really seem to do it on the phone anymore. Like that was always the worst. But the thing where it's like we have this new men's shoe that we're bringing out, and it's just not my beat. And you've got the wrong guy, and I have a common name, and
Yeah, that happens. We understand. So for your mind, though, what do you look for in a story? What are the elements that make for a perfect story for you?
I guess I really try to break news. I want new news. Ideally, it's new news that somebody doesn't want released.
Excellent.
And it's going to cause some trouble.
Yeah.
And then,
that's pretty much Dan Rather's definition.
And then in the context of, and then in a way that says something interesting about some big topic or allows me to then clumsily segue onto some bigger topic.
Okay. So how long does it take you to write a column?
It's like this kind of crazy job where I get to spend a whole week writing a thing. So I spend the whole week I report a lot and then write on, I write pretty fast. If you have tons of reporting, then writing 1,000 words is it's all about just what you leave out. And
then what's the process after you actually hand in a finished piece? How many people look at it before it actually gets published?
Typically 2. This is actually one of the things about the Times that has been really nice because hadn't worked there before and barely worked there, right? It's COVID and I don't go to the office and I know lots of people there, but I knew lots of people there before.
Right.
But just the quality of the editing is incredibly high. One editor who does a really, really strong, aggressive edit on the piece and then passes it on to another editor who works weekends, who again, just really asks a lot of hard questions and catches sloppy errors. And it's really been really interesting. Just the amount of investment in editing is nice. Feels like a luxury as a writer.
Do they ever send anything back with a little, what were you thinking when you wrote this kind of a edit?
No, the nice thing about the old fashioned newspaper edit is they just rewrite it. Which is how I like to edit. The new style edit where you don't want to hurt the writer's feelings. And so you're this is really great, but would you want to think about adding some more facts and details and removing the parts that are bullshit? And then, but also I really think you're a great reporter is such an annoying waste of time. And it's nice just to be hey, I totally rewrote your piece from top to bottom. Here it is. It's a lot better. We're going to publish it now. That's great.
All right. And do you learn from the edits they make? Do you go over it and say, oh, now I see what they wanted me to do?
Yeah, totally. And I think I've been doing this a long time, but I think they have a very clear sense of their own audience. The Times does,
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting to that the strong editors there will be no, our audience will be interested in this. Particularly you can't take for granted that they know what you're talking about here and need to write in a more general. And it's been really interesting.
Okay. How would you describe the difference between this and BuzzFeed?
It's all on the internet, right? So it's, in some ways, it's not that different.
Right.
But I think that, it's different institutions have different kind of mandates. Part of it is just that the brand of the Times, it's and it's often kind of annoying because I don't really think of myself as a spokesperson for the Times, but your stuff kind of gets taken that way. But on the other hand, it comes with all this sort of built-in credibility that BuzzFeed didn't have. I kind of get all this kind of unearned credibility from the Times, where at BuzzFeed, you always had to earn it.
Right. I understand. Now, have people started to look at you differently? Other journalists look at you differently now that you're in this spot?
Yeah, probably. I don't know. It's a weird job. Yeah, I think like, yeah, particularly like if you're like, I think television journalists in particular, and the sort of big sort of
Yeah.
personality based folks, like have a very clear sense of like that this column is sort of important and passes judgment. And that's not really how I'm trying to do it, but yeah, I think they care about it a lot.
So what are you trying to do with your column?
For me, it's just like an incredible opportunity to just like ask questions and learn stuff about things that I think are interesting and that I think hope other people will find interesting. And so I'm just really trying to do that without some grander project.
Okay. All right. So I have some questions here from folks who are listening in no particular order now. So you ready? How did you end up in Latvia?
Oh, so after college, it was like 1999. And for like people of my like weird nerdy world, everybody wanted to go to Prague. Yeah. Like Prague is the hot European city at the moment. I'd actually studied Czech, but everybody wanted to work at the Prague Post, and I couldn't get a job at the Prague Post. And so I wound up at the Baltic Times in Riga, Latvia.
And how would you rate the experience now, looking back on it?
Somewhere far away where it's like there's not a lot of journalists and it's not that competitive, and you sort of are figuring out the job in that context. You do learn a lot.
Mm-hmm. Do you use that experience to kind of look at American journalism maybe a little bit differently?
I don't know. I do think there's a difference between, it's funny because I have this totally insider job and I've been working as sort of an insider for a long time, but I do think I think of myself probably wrongly as an outsider.
Okay.
But because I didn't come up inside one of these big institutions, kind of like getting coffee for somebody's assistant and then becoming the assistant and sort of that track.
Yeah. In one of your more recent columns, you mentioned how you look to the BBC and people outside of the American press and compare how bad we are at interviewing compared to others that somehow seem to be more interesting in some way.
Yeah, I don't, bad is maybe the wrong word, but I do think in American TV, it's like these hosts whose job is really fundamentally to be liked and to be there for you while you eat your breakfast. And and I think that they think about being liked, and they think about themselves almost as political candidates or as characters in a show. And so, they don't want to be jerks. And I think that in British and Australian TV, you just see, it's just sort of a different way of thinking about the job. And often you're like, who is this like pompous old jerk who's just being like unbelievably nasty to Jeremy Corbyn to Ben, but like Andrew Neil is unbelievably pompous and sort of like difficult with everyone and is himself a conservative, but really sees the job as challenging you hard on whatever your sort of highest profile beliefs are. And there was this incredible thing where Ben Shapiro, who's sort of this conservative American journalist who I think, sort of sees himself as a debater, just totally sort of crumbles as Neil pushes him because I think he didn't really expect it, didn't know what to do with it.
So where do you see American news going? How is it trending from your perspective?
In lots of different directions. Like I think there are sort of trends going in opposite directions from each other. You have, you have these huge institutions, the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, sort of like gathering more strength as like regional newspapers and metro newspapers collapse. But then also all around the edges, you have new technology that's allowing individuals to run and small groups of people to run subscription businesses in a pretty promising way.
Okay. All right. Now, you have written in the past about the collapse of the local newspapers. And would you say you're kind of in favor of that position, of that happening? In the traditional sense of a newspaper?
I think it's kind of a tragedy, right? Like, and that the great metro papers of the 20th century, Newsday on Long Island and many others were obviously these incredibly important institutions for all their flaws.
Yeah.
I think a lot of them, are really basically dead now. And I think, you'll see people complaining that they've been bought by vultures. And the thing about vultures is they feed on things that are dead. And so like, rather than trying to revive the carcass of the thing that's being pecked at by vultures, I do think it's important, to think about, if you are in particularly like a civic leader with a certain amount of money who is thinking about investing it in journalism, do you try to buy like the Gannett paper with a bunch of debt in various directions and a printing plant? Or do you think it's going to be much, you're dollar for dollar, you're going to be getting a lot more journalism if you start something new? And I think you do see these nonprofits springing up in a really promising way all over the country, and a lot of really good journalism happening there.
But do you see any type of training going on in the traditional local newspapers that prepare them for dealing with news today, or for
I think it's almost like, I think most journalists used to come up through local newspapers. And so there was a kind of standardized training. And again, kind of for better and for worse, honestly. Like, I think you did there was something about just the requirement that you be accurate when you cover a murder or a crime story or something that's very, very important to a handful of people. But it's like incredibly important that you get it right. That's a really good discipline that I think some reporters don't quite learn. Like, hey, I just need you to like cover this murder and the deadline is in 2 hours. Like, it's just a good skill that some reporters now just have never picked up. But on the other hand, those newspapers had a kind of pretty like sexist culture and a kind of conformist culture of their own, and kind of tended to, they had all their own problems. And so like, I don't want to romanticize it too much, but I think basically there's not so much a standardized way of learning anymore. And I think people often just sort of watch each other on the internet. And if you're not careful, sort of like learn to kind of perform journalism on the internet rather than to report and get information.
Perform as in want to be a star, perform?
As in like show off on Twitter how clever you are rather than break news.
I wanted to kind of latch on to current events right now with Woodward's admission that, he held on to these quotes from Trump for his book, but didn't disclose them. What's your feeling on this topic?
I think it's complicated. I think that the idea, if only that like, of all the sort of like hay that has been piled on Trump, like the straw that would have broken the camel's back would have been this Bob Woodward quote. I don't know. I think
bigger picture, you don't see it as that important?
Like, I just think that there's just this belief that like the media, that Trump is primarily a product of the New York Times and the Washington Post. If only they'd behaved somewhat differently, then he wouldn't be president and we wouldn't be in this situation. I don't really see much evidence for that. I think the Woodward thing is complicated, right? Like, he kind of is what he is. Like, that interview, of course, doesn't take place except on the sort of tacit understanding that it's for a book later. It's incredibly damning. Would you have, just you personally, were you in March saying like, what does Donald Trump say about the science? Because like, that's what I want to know to determine my personal behavior. I always ask what Donald Trump thinks about pathogens before I decide what medical steps to take. Like, that is not how I live my personal life. So I don't know. Would it have changed things a lot?
No, I understand what you're saying. But there does seem to be something happening here, though. If you take kind of that scenario and build it on what we were just talking about, how the traditional news reporting, if you started local and the focus was you need to be accurate, you need to check facts, that sort of thing. Today, it seems like we've got media that has morphed into, where did the objective journalism go? Now there's a lot of opinion-driven journalism out there. And even from people doing objective journalism, they spend a lot of time online spewing opinions. So you kind of wonder, where do you find credibility today and how do you build it?
I think this is incredibly challenging stuff. I guess my own view, but I'm not sure that really will bear out, is that, if you there are sort of two ways. Like, you have a kind of big old institutional brand that people really trust and believe in a kind of ongoing way, like the New York Times, and you defend that brand more or less and try to, have it stay clear. Or your BuzzFeed, where I spent the last 8 years, and nobody's going to be like, oh, wow, I believe that because I read it in BuzzFeed. And so you have to be really transparent. You have to say to your readers, like, you don't have to trust us because here are all the documents. You can like replicate our journalism basically, and try to be really, really transparent about who you are and where you're coming from, so that you can, and even a journalist who's like, even a reader who's like, I hate these people and I think they're assholes, can but like, hey, you know what? Like I can follow the details here and understand how they got these facts, even if I disagree with an interpretation.
Okay. All right. Do you think it's important for media to apologize?
Only when they get things wrong. But yes,
Okay.
for sure. And correct. I mean, one of the great things with the internet is you can just it used to be like you get something wrong in the paper and then like 2 days later on page 3, there's some tiny little text that corrects it. But basically the lie is sort of irretrievable. Whereas you can really walk it back now and do it effectively and erase your error. And I think that's great.
I do see a lot of like the old school happening though online where they just add a little footnote saying, the following ears in this story, as opposed to either changing the story to update it, or in some cases, if the story is proven wrong, shouldn't they just take it down? Why leave it in cyberspace?
Yeah, I think that's a big problem. Like what do you do about, like, I think, a story that is just totally wrong, like not like maybe even sentence by sentence it's right, but like the whole premise is wrong. And I think most news organizations have had that problem. I wrote a piece in the New Yorker recently that was like totally wrong, but they managed to get it to a sentence by sentence it wasn't wrong. And yeah, I think journalism is better at correcting minor errors than major ones.
How would you change that though?
I don't know. I mean, I think that it's there's a sort of defensiveness around like the big things and admitting that you were like totally wrong on some big topic. Like the one I think about sometimes is nuclear energy. Okay. Just to go back to all the coverage of nuclear energy from the 70s and the 80s. Okay. And it's like, oh man, like actually we just missed the risk of climate change. And everybody writing about the dangers of nuclear energy was like totally wrong because they didn't realize that carbon emissions were this other danger, right? Like how do you sort of evaluate that? I don't know. It's hard and often only visible like long in retrospect.
Yeah, well, it's sort of like the coronavirus coverage too. We know so much more about it from a science perspective months after.
And I think, part of it is that this stuff isn't meant, journalism it's like, this is the best we know right now. And we shouldn't be pretending it's more. This stuff isn't written in stone. In some ways, like the internet preserves stuff that shouldn't be preserved at all. Like it's a conversation. It's almost like an oral culture, right? Like it's
right.
Maybe the first draft of history, but like emphasis on first draft. And you shouldn't be getting, and it's not something, it's something useful for historians to read and put into context later, but it's not written in stone. And I think, the internet does preserve stuff that you would have had to look up on microfiche and probably should be stuck in microfiche somewhere and kind of hard to get because like, obviously you see things clearly in retrospect.
Right. Yeah. And for people that are younger and listening to this, there was a time before the internet where if something appeared in the daily paper, it was tossed out the next day. It didn't live online. And if something aired on the news, unless you taped it or recorded it, it was gone. So it evaporated. So it seems to me there was a different level of responsibility almost when you knew the information would be instantly gone after you've published it versus now.
I'm not sure people were more or less responsible. I mean, they probably should have felt more responsibility back then. In a way, things were easier to fix now. So perhaps errors are in that, by that argument, are less sort of lasting. But I'm not sure anybody ever was that much more responsible.
Okay. But now with the internet and basically anyone can claim that they're a news outlet, do you think that has kind of saturated the marketplace and made it really hard for the news consumer to really understand the difference now between an actual news outlet versus someone's crazy uncle, putting out some kind of newsletter in the basement?
And by the way, there has always been a spectrum, and your crazy uncle has always put out that newsletter. He just used to mail it directly to his subscribers. But yeah, I think it's an incredibly disorienting moment because it used to be that you would like see that newsletter and you'd be like, okay, like I get what this is. It's one of these like crazy newsletters, but like maybe the guy's brilliant. It's interesting, but I can see by the way it was printed and the kind of paper it's on and the typeface, what it is, I'm familiar with that. And similarly, like, this is an editorial and this is opinion because it's like on the back page of the first section and has a picture of the guy, and this is a news story. And I think the internet strips all that context. And also like the conventions aren't really, if you see in a print newspaper or something with like a dark border around it, and the text is maybe a little smaller, a little bigger, and in a different font, you're like, oh, that's an advertisement. But there's no exact equivalent on the internet for that. And so I think it's just really disorienting. I think some of those conventions have gradually grown up. But at BuzzFeed, we were like, when we were doing sponsored content, there was this idea that it was like stealth advertising, that brands were trying to sneak it in. But of course, the brands mostly, like, they wanted to be associated with it. It was an ad. That was kind of the point. And so we were always like trying to figure out, like, how do we signal this is an ad? And so for a while, Google sponsored searches were in yellow. They would have a yellow overlay, and we're like, oh, cool. Okay, yellow is the color for advertising. We'll put a yellow overlay on ads. Makes sense. And then Google changes it. And it's like, oh, guess that's not the convention. But there just wasn't the sort of like, there just isn't the sort of kind of conventions that grew up around print that just make things very clear for members of the audience.
Yeah, since everything sort of morphed together, and it lives online, but there's no consistent labeling or look. Like if you go to a movie, you know what a rating is going to look like. You know? So I wonder if we just don't shoot ourselves in the foot by not getting together and saying, let's at least just identify these things so that the public understands what we're about.
Yep.
I know it sounds easier in theory than in actuality of getting all those people in a room together. How do you feel about the White House press briefings today? Do you think those should continue?
I mean, I think that, they're sort of a show in which Trump, like kind of, it's Trump fights with the press, and Trump's supporters love it. And I think it's great for the personal brands and for the sort of like theater of cable news. But I don't know. It's a challenge that I'm not sure there's an easy answer to. Like the whole sort of ritual of asking people questions it is important that they sort of respect the convention that you're supposed to tell the truth and that you kind of have some shame. And when the person you're talking to doesn't, it is hard to understand what it's for.
Okay. All right. How do you think reporters should be dealing with the concept of alternative facts?
Yeah, I don't know. I think we should not, obviously there is no such thing. And I think reporters, and I think are getting better at just, just trying to stick to what's actually going on and not allowing people to sort of, not like giving people lots of space to voice their opinions about things that aren't actually up for the sky blue.
Since we're going into political season, what do you think the public needs to look out for when it comes to the news media covering the election?
At this point, I think one of the really big stories of this election is that most people have made up their minds. There are not a ton of undecided voters. If you're deciding, I think, it's important that whatever media you're consuming is telling you what the candidates' policies are on the various issues and stuff. I think more broad, but the biggest question around this election is kind of what happens when the votes are cast and when they're counted, and whether the media overly, whether the media makes election sort of sits there tapping its foot, and if the results aren't in on the night of the election, treats it like something illegitimate has happened, or whether the media can kind of help people be patient because the vote counting could take a while. Like I actually think that's the biggest space where the biggest and sort of scariest mistakes could happen is on election. People talk about election night, but really it's quite likely to be like election week or election month.
So what is your prediction for what the story of 2020 will be?
It depends who wins the election, right?
You think it's all tied into politics?
Yeah, I do think so, because I think, the big, obviously COVID is this sort of huge story, and the climate crisis is a huge story. They are both in some way political stories. They're stories about governance and governments making decisions, and and obviously there are huge differences in how Trump and his rivals see them.
So you don't feel you can cover stories like that without some aspect of politics playing a role?
I know, of course you can, but I think, and a lot of the story of COVID is not a political story. It's about a virus and how viruses work. But clearly, you can't. I would say more of the reverse. Like you can't really cover the election story as something that's about political tactics. It's about governance.
Okay. All right. I have a question here. It's actually coming from the CEO of the Center for Public Integrity. who's asking, how are conversations around racial representation challenging definitions of journalism?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think like Black Lives Matter has just been this, really sweeping conversation that's touched everybody in the country and every industry. And I think in journalism, there have long been important conversations about diversity, but there's also, I think, for a long time been a kind of tacit bargain that if you're, say, a Black reporter, that, we'd like you, that the newsroom would like to have you, but would also expect you to bite your tongue on issues of race in particular. Mm-hmm. And I think that's and I think it's good that that's breaking down. I mean, it's complicated also, but that you see Black reporters, their experience of race is a kind of expertise. They know a lot about race and racism, or some do, and some won't. And I think the old bargain that and Brent Staples on the Times editorial board talks about this, but just that you're like, we'd love to have you, but as long as you keep your mouth shut on certain things is I think over, and I think newsrooms are realizing that, when you talk about representation, that actually means you're going to have a wider spectrum of points of view inside the newsroom, and you have, and dealing with that, you can't just sort of, and that's not just doing exactly the same thing as you were doing yesterday. And I think that's a really meaningful and interesting change. Okay.
Great big step forward for a lot of newsrooms, right? One thing that I wanted to bring up is you had actually mentioned this in a recent column also. When you were at BuzzFeed, you published the Steele dossier. And at the time, I believe you were quoted by someone as saying, if someone contradicted you for publishing that or criticized you for publishing that, your response was, if we err, it's on the error of publishing. Is that a correct
Yeah,
statement?
I think that's right. Yeah. The media ought to err on the side of transparency. Although I don't think that was an error. So.
Okay, I was going to say, looking back, how do you feel about it? Would you have changed anything that you had done?
I think it was clearly the right call. I mean, I think as that year even developed, you may recall there was this huge fight between Devin Nunes and Adam Schiff that would have been like genuinely incomprehensible if you weren't allowed to talk about the dossier. We'd have had a situation where all these media organizations were saying, well, these two very powerful congressmen are fighting, but unfortunately, we can't tell you what it's about because we have this secret document. We can't show it to you because it would like burn your eyes out if you looked at it. But, we can tell you it's really shocking. I mean, it's not. Yeah. It just doesn't make any sense. When you have a document that's been briefed to two different presidents of the United States, that's being circulated, fought over, acted on at these very, very high levels of power, it's obviously in the public interest to understand that it is there, and also that, by the way, that it's not verified. No federal judge agreed with us on that in the end.
Okay, all right. Well, one of the things you mentioned in your column is when you published it, you thought about publishing it. You didn't really think about the aftermath of what would happen once it was published.
Yeah.
So looking back now, were you surprised at what happened after it was published?
I've been surprised by so many things, right? It's been a surprising couple of years. I just think it's really important that you not, as a reporter, spend the time kind of gaming out the political consequences of revealing things that are real. I think you can really sort of get yourself twisted up and wind up kind of breaking a compact with your audience if you do that.
Okay, so you're more of a let's focus on the job, and whatever happens after we do the job is what happens?
Yeah, I think reporters have like a real. I mean, it's not. Of course, it's not totally that simple. And you obviously worry about consequences to individuals. In a way that if you're, and you shouldn't be carelessly harming people, which is very easily done with journalism, particularly in various sort of digitally related ways. But I think if you're saying, should I lie to my audience or suppress things because I'm afraid my audience can't handle it, you're going down a kind of dangerous road.
Okay, fair enough. So let me end with one more question for you. So what's the best part about being Ben Smith today?
I don't know. Hanging out with my kids in nice fall weather.
The Fair Media Council is a 501c3 nonprofit organization advocating for quality news and working to create a media-savvy society. For more information about the Fair Media Council and upcoming Fast Chat shows, check out fairmediacouncil.org.
This podcast is a part of the C-Suite Radio Network. For more top business podcasts, visit c-suiteradio.com.